The grand hall of the Varkari dominion was silent, the air thick with tension. Towering crystalline pillars shimmered with a soft, bioluminescent glow, casting elongated shadows across the dark marble floor. Rows of high-ranking officials and warriors stood in disciplined lines, their expressions cold, unreadable. At the center of it all stood Queen Zatrala, draped in elaborate silver and indigo robes, her presence commanding absolute reverence. Before her, kneeling with one hand pressed to the floor in submission, was Kieres. The young warrior's bioluminescent sigils pulsed erratically along her deep indigo skin, betraying the turmoil within her. She had prepared for this moment, knowing what it meant, but nothing could have steadied her heart as the queen's piercing violet eyes bore down upon her. So the rumors are true. You really bonded with the human, Queen Zatrala said, her voice even, yet laced with something deeper, disapproval, curiosity, perhaps even disappointment. A murmur rippled through the chamber, though no one dared speak out of turn. The weight of unspoken judgment pressed against Kieres' chest. She raised her gaze to meet the queen's. Yes, my queen, she admitted, her voice unwavering despite the storm raging inside her. The murmurs grew louder. Bonding with a human was not merely unconventional, it was an outright violation of centuries-old doctrine. The Varkari prided themselves on their lineage, their superior biology, their rigid sense of control over emotion. To entwine oneself with a species so unpredictable, so raw, was unthinkable. Yet here stood Kieres, a warrior of high regard, confessing to the ultimate transgression. The queen stepped forward, her robe whispering against the smooth floor as she descended from her throne. She stood only a few feet from Kieres now, studying her as though searching for some sign of weakness. Who is this human? Zatrala asked. Kieres' heart clenched. His face flashed in her mind. His persistent curiosity, the way he would tilt his head in fascination when studying her. His rare but devastating smiles that had undone her every attempt at restraint. Dorian Voss, she answered. The name meant nothing to most in the room, but to her it was everything. Her mind drifted back to the beginning, to the day she had met him. It had been 6 months ago when she was assigned as an envoy to Earth, stationed in a city called Seattle. The assignment was meant to be brief, observe, report, and ensure the success of the diplomatic relations between their species. Humans were still relatively new to intergalactic politics, and the Varkari, cautious as ever, sought to assess them carefully before granting them any deeper alliance. Kieres had expected resistance, tension, and maybe even hostility. What she had not expected was Dorian Voss. He was a scientist specializing in xenobiology, handpicked to assist in the integration of Varkari visitors. Their first meeting had been anything but smooth. She had been standing in the research facility's observation wing, scanning reports, when he had approached her without hesitation, breaking what she had assumed to be an unspoken rule of human decorum, to keep their distance. "You're staring," he had remarked. She had blinked, unaware she had been scrutinizing him. "I am analyzing," she had corrected. Dorian had smirked, his hazel eyes glinting with amusement. "Well, that makes two of us." Kieres had found humans to be strangely expressive, but Dorian's gaze had been particularly sharp, as though he could see past the layers of protocol and into the person beneath. She had dismissed the moment as inconsequential, yet it had remained with her long after she had walked away. Their interactions became frequent, always beginning with professional courtesy and inevitably drifting into something more personal. He had a habit of asking questions, not the kind meant to challenge, but to understand. Why don't Varkari form emotional bonds easily? Is it true your species can suppress attraction at will? What do you think about humans, personally? She had attempted to remain detached, answering each inquiry with the calculated precision expected of her station. But Dorian had a way of making detachment impossible. One evening, at a diplomatic gathering, she had found herself standing at the edge of a balcony, gazing out at the human city stretched before her. The rain fell softly, reflecting the neon glow of the streets below. It was beautiful in a way she had never acknowledged before. She had sensed him before he spoke. "You seem lost in thought." She had turned her head slightly, finding him standing beside her, his posture relaxed but observant. "Varkari, do not get lost in thought," she had replied evenly. Dorian had smiled then, small, fleeting but genuine. "That so? Then what are you doing?" She had hesitated, then admitted, wondering. He had leaned forward against the railing. "About?" She had shifted her gaze back to the city. Why humans find meaning in things like rain, the flickering of artificial lights, the silence between words. Dorian had chuckled, and for some reason, the sound had warmed something in her chest. Because meaning isn't always something you're born with. Sometimes you have to create it. The words had unsettled her. The Varkari had always believed in absolutes, order, hierarchy, control. Yet here was a species that thrived on chaos, on emotion, on carving their own paths rather than following what was dictated to them. And somehow, despite herself, she had found it captivating. She had not realized she was staring again until Dorian turned his head to meet her gaze directly. "You don't have to hide what you feel, you know," Kieres had scoffed. "Varkari do not express emotions as humans do." Dorian had reached out then, not forcefully, but deliberately, taking her hand in his. His skin had been warm, the touch unfamiliar yet strangely grounding. "Then don't think of it as emotion. Think of it as an understanding." Something had shifted in that moment. She had not pulled away. Back in the present, before the queen and the weight of her people's judgment, she felt that moment all over again. "You love this human," Zatrala said, not as a question, but as a statement. Kieres did not hesitate. "Yes." The murmur became an uproar. Zatrala remained silent for several long seconds before she turned her back to Kieres and walked slowly toward the throne. "You realize what this means," she finally said. "I do," Kieres answered. "Then you know the consequences." The air in the chamber became heavier. Kieres braced herself. "You will undergo the trial of devotion." The silence that followed was absolute. Kieres's pulse thundered in her ears. The trial of devotion was an ancient practice, one meant to test the legitimacy of a bond. It was grueling, often deadly. No Varkari had ever undergone it for a human before. Dorian was escorted into the chamber then, his expression unreadable, though his eyes immediately locked onto hers. He must have heard everything. "What does this trial entail?" he asked, his voice steady. Zatrala regarded him with quiet scrutiny. "A test of endurance, sacrifice, and will. If your bond is true, you will survive. If not, you will perish, and Kieres will be cast from the dominion in disgrace." Kieres's breath caught. "No, he is not Varkari. He does not have our physiology." "Then he has already failed," the queen interrupted. Dorian stepped forward before Kieres could argue further. He took her hand again, his grip firm. "Let me do this," he said, voice low. She searched his face for hesitation. There was none. With a slow, pained nod, she stepped back. "Then let the trial begin," Queen Zatrala declared. The chamber doors slammed shut, sealing Kieres and Dorian inside the ceremonial hall. The sound echoed like a final judgment, reverberating through the ancient stone walls. Torches of blue fire lined the perimeter, casting eerie shadows over the intricate carvings of Varkari history. Victories, conquests, and the unbroken lineage of warriors who had never once faltered in devotion to their people. Dorian exhaled slowly, his fingers still wrapped around Kieres's hand. His warmth grounded her, but she could sense the rapid beat of his pulse against her skin. He was afraid, though he refused to show it. Kieres tightened her grip. "We can still stop this," she whispered. "You don't have to prove anything." He turned to her, hazel eyes searching hers. "This isn't just about proving something. It's about us." The door on the opposite side of the chamber slid open with a deep, grinding sound. A figure stepped inside, Jiran, the arbiter of the trial. His towering form was clad in ceremonial armor, his face partially obscured by the intricate mask of his station. He raised a staff, striking it against the ground. "The trial of devotion begins now." His voice resonated through the chamber, powerful and unwavering. Two additional figures emerged, Varkari sentinels, each carrying a long ceremonial blade with a curved, gleaming edge. Kieres knew what was coming next. You will each undergo a test, Geron declared. 3 trials to prove your bond. The first is the trial of pain. Dorian's fingers twitched, though his face remained still. Kieres felt something ice-cold settle in her gut. The trial of pain was brutal, designed to test endurance, willpower, and emotional connection. For Varkari, pain tolerance was a defining trait, a measure of their discipline. But humans, her breath grew shallow. Dorian was not Varkari. The sentinels approached with the ceremonial blades. Kieres immediately stepped in front of Dorian, baring her fangs. No, I will take his trial. Geron did not move. That is not how the trial of devotion works. You will each endure. Kieres snarled, the warrior in her rising to the surface. You would subject a human to this? He does not possess our physiology. And yet he claims to be worthy of a Varkari, Geron interrupted coldly. If his devotion is true, he will endure. Dorian's voice was quiet but firm. I'll do it. Kieres' eyes snapped to him in disbelief. Dorian. He turned to her with a small, unwavering smile. You're not alone in this. I'm not letting you go through it by yourself. The firelight flickered in his eyes, and something deep inside her ached. He had no idea what he was about to endure, and yet he was willing to face it. Not because of duty or obligation, but because he chose to stand beside her. She swallowed hard and forced herself to nod. The sentinels moved quickly, securing both of them in place. Kieres was familiar with the restraints, thick energy bands that locked around her wrists, tethering her to the stone pillars behind them. Dorian, however, hissed softly when the cold metal clamped down on him. She could see the way his muscles tensed, the instinct to resist flickering across his face before he forced himself still. A sentinel stepped forward, pressing a device to Kieres' temple. A pulse of searing energy lanced through her body. She sucked in a sharp breath as the pain tore through her nerves, fire racing through every vein. But she did not scream. She had trained for this, endured worse in battle. Dorian was not so lucky. The moment the device was pressed to his temple, his entire body went rigid. His jaw clenched, muscles spasming violently as the shock tore through him. Kieres watched in horror as he bit down so hard she feared he might shatter his teeth. She thrashed against the restraints. Stop! Geron observed impassively. He has not yielded, Dorian gasped, his breath ragged, but he forced himself to remain upright. His fingers curled into fists, nails digging into his palms. The muscles in his arms and neck trembled from the strain, but he refused to scream. Kieres' chest tightened. She could feel the pain echoing through the bond they shared. She had always believed humans to be fragile, but in this moment, she realized just how wrong she had been. His will was stronger than even some Varkari warriors she had fought beside. When the device finally powered down, Dorian sagged forward, gasping for air. Kieres felt the restraints release, and she rushed to his side, catching him before he collapsed completely. His skin was damp with sweat, his body trembling from the aftershocks, but when he looked up at her, he smiled. Still standing, he rasped. Something inside her broke. The pain of the trial hadn't shaken her as much as his resilience had. Geron observed them both before nodding. The first trial is complete. The sentinels moved aside, revealing the next chamber. A vast, open space with a towering pit in the center. A deep, gaping abyss with no visible bottom. Kieres felt dread coil in her stomach. The second trial, Geron announced, is the trial of trust. The meaning was clear. One of them would have to fall and the other would have to catch them. She had undergone this before, but always with a Varkari partner. A partner who knew how to link their nervous systems, how to anticipate the exact moment to act. Dorian did not have that advantage. He turned to her, rubbing at his wrists. What's the catch? She exhaled. One of us must fall. He frowned. And the other? Catches them. A moment of silence. Then Dorian grinned. That's easy. She narrowed her eyes. Is it? His expression softened. I trust you. Her throat tightened. He trusts me. Without hesitation. No Valkyrie had ever trusted so freely. She hated the idea of letting him fall, even though she knew she would catch him. But he was already stepping toward the ledge. He turned, meeting her gaze. Tell me when. Kieres felt her heart hammering. She had to catch him. Now, she said. Dorian let go. He fell backward, arms outstretched, surrendering himself completely to the abyss. Kieres moved, her body reacting on instinct. She launched forward, diving after him, twisting midair as she reached out. Her hands clasped his. Their bodies collided, momentum pulling them down. But Kieres flared her bioluminescent sigils, her strength anchoring them as she snapped the energy bands on her wrists. They stopped just inches from the bottom. For a moment, silence. Then Dorian laughed. Kieres, breathless, held him tightly, their bodies suspended in the air. His arms wrapped around her, his heartbeat racing against her chest. You caught me, he murmured. Her hands shook as she held him. Of course I did. Geron's voice echoed from above. The second trial is complete. Kieres, still holding Dorian, looked up toward the final chamber. She could feel it. The last trial would be the most dangerous of all. Kieres barely had time to steady herself before the ground beneath them shifted. The platform they landed on began to rise, lifting them toward the final chamber. Dorian was still breathing heavily, but his grip on her arms remained firm. She could feel his pulse hammering beneath his skin, a raw reminder of what they had just endured. You okay? She asked, her voice lower than usual. Dorian smirked, despite the lingering exhaustion in his eyes. You caught me, didn't you? She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head, but she couldn't deny the warmth curling in her chest. His trust in her had been absolute, and that, more than anything, unsettled her. The platform slowed as they reached the upper chamber. The walls here were different, ancient, marked with deep, jagged carvings of figures locked in battle. The air felt heavier, charged with something old and restless. At the far end of the room stood Queen Zatrala. Her golden armor shimmered under the eerie blue torches, the edges of her cloak barely brushing the floor as she regarded them with piercing eyes. Beside her, Geron stood silent, his presence a shadow to the Queen's command. You have endured the trial of pain, Zatrala said, her voice smooth but edged with something sharper. You have surpassed the trial of trust. Now comes the final test, one that no mere bond of convenience can withstand. Dorian glanced at Kieres. Let me guess. It's got a fancy, ominous name. Kieres didn't return his smirk this time. Her chest tightened. The trial of sacrifice, she murmured. Dorian's expression turned serious. Yeah, that doesn't sound great. Zatrala stepped forward, her golden eyes narrowing. A warrior's devotion is measured not by what they endure, but by what they are willing to give up. She turned her gaze toward Kieres. Tell me, my warrior, if it meant saving him, would you surrender everything? Your honor, your rank, your very place among us. Kieres had no hesitation. Yes. Dorian tensed beside her, but she didn't look at him. Her eyes remained locked on the Queen, unwavering. Zatrala tilted her head. So certain, a low rumble echoed through the chamber. The walls shifted again, and from the shadows, two armored Valkyrie warriors emerged, dragging something heavy between them. Kieres' heart stopped. It was her blade. The great war blade, the symbol of her status, the weapon that had been passed down through her lineage. The very thing that defined her as a warrior. Geron's voice was as cold as the steel. The trial of sacrifice requires one of you to give up the thing that defines you most. For you, Kieres, that is your legacy. Dorian frowned. And for me, Zatrala's gaze flicked toward him. Your freedom. Silence. Kieres inhaled sharply. What? The Queen's voice was eerily calm. You have fought. You have endured. But if your bond is truly unbreakable, then let us see which of you is willing to pay the higher price. Will you, Kieres, surrender your place as a warrior? Or will your human surrender his right to return to his own kind? Dorian's breath hitched. Kieres stepped forward instantly. "Take my blade." But Zatrala raised a hand, silencing her. "He must decide first." Kieres turned, panic rising in her chest. Dorian stood frozen, his brows drawn together, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. Stay. Stay here on an alien world, in a culture that barely tolerated his presence. He had a life beyond this back on Earth. His research, his work, his people. If he accepted, he would never see them again. Her voice wavered. "Dorian, I'll do it." The words left him before she could stop them. A ringing silence filled the room. Kieres stared at him. Dorian exhaled, looking directly at Zatrala. "If I have to choose between going back to my old life and staying with her." He turned to Kieres, and there was nothing hesitant in his gaze. "I'll stay." Something inside her fractured. He was willing to give up everything. For her. Zatrala's expression didn't shift, but her eyes gleamed with something unreadable. "Very well." Geron stepped forward, withdrawing a small, dark device from his sleeve. "A binding mark, a symbol that you have forsaken your place among humans. It will be written into your very genetic code." Kieres felt her breath catch. She had thought the trials were cruel before, but this was something else. "Dorian." She reached for him, but he was already stepping forward, standing tall before Geron. She hated this. Hated that he had to make this choice. Hated that she couldn't stop it. The moment the device touched his arm, Dorian hissed sharply. A searing glow spread across his skin, embedding itself in his very flesh. A mark of the Varkari. A permanent severance from his old life. Kieres felt her hands trembling. Dorian turned to her, his breath shallow, his expression searching. "I'm still here," he whispered. She reached up, brushing her fingers over the mark that now branded him as one of her people. This wasn't right, but she knew deep down there was no going back now. Kieres barely noticed as the chamber walls shifted again, revealing a path leading away from the Queen's throne. Her hands still hovered over the mark on Dorian's arm, her fingers cold despite the warmth of his skin. He had done this for her, given up everything, for her. "You didn't have to," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Dorian exhaled, a quiet huff of breath that carried the weight of finality. "Didn't I?" His lips curled into something softer than a smile. "You would have done it for me." Yes, without hesitation. But this was different. She had been prepared for this kind of sacrifice. She was Varkari, raised to accept loss, to endure. Dorian was human. His world had not prepared him for this. She turned towards Zatrala, her chest tight with something dangerously close to desperation. There must be another way. The Queen watched them both, golden eyes unreadable. "The trial is complete. There is no reversing the choice." Kieres clenched her fists. "Then let me share the burden. Bind me to him." Dorian's head snapped toward her. "Kieres." But Zatrala let out a low, almost amused hum. "You would take the mark as well?" "If it means I stand with him, yes." A flicker of something, approval, crossed the Queen's face. "Then kneel." Kieres dropped to one knee without hesitation. She barely felt the searing burn as Geron pressed the device to her shoulder. A second mark flared to life, identical to Dorian's. Permanent. Irrevocable. Dorian's hands found hers as the pain ebbed away. His grip was strong, steady, grounding. "You're insane," he murmured. But his voice was thick with something else. Something raw. She squeezed his hands, her throat tightening. "You're stuck with me now." A slow grin tugged at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, guess I am." Zatrala observed them for a long moment before stepping forward. "You have proven the depth of your bond," she said. "Not just to each other, but to your people and to mine." Kieres's jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means," the Queen said, with a knowing gleam in her eyes, "that you will not be outcasts." Dorian's brows shot up. "Wait, so I can stay, but not as some exile?" Zatrala tilted her head. "You will still bear the mark, human. But you are no longer just an outsider bound by trial. You are bound by choice." Kieres's breath caught. This wasn't exile. This was something else. Acceptance. Dorian blinked, processing it. "Huh," he said finally. "Could have led with that." Zatrala's lips twitched ever so slightly. "Would you have chosen any differently?" Dorian glanced at Kiere's. Their fingers were still entwined, her grip still firm around his. "No," he admitted. "I wouldn't." Zatrala stepped back. "Then go. You have proven yourselves worthy of the path ahead." Together, as the chamber doors opened, revealing the world beyond, Kieres felt something shift deep inside her. Dorian was hers, and she was his. There was no going back, and she wouldn't have it any other way.